My name's David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. It's great to have you all here. There's so many reasons to be grateful for the arrival of the annual Maine Sustainability and Water Conference. It's a chance to reconnect with old friends, to make new ones, celebrate successes, take on emerging challenges, expand our collaborations, all the while strengthening connections between people and nature. Speaking for myself, it's also an opportunity to be thankful that I was able to make it up my driveway during the long winter on most days, and to celebrate the arrival of mud season. And if mud season's here, then I think black fly season can't be too far behind. Before I introduce a really wonderful thing we're going to do next, I'm also incredibly thankful for all the people that make this conference possible. Wonderful sponsors, they're on the program. If you see them, thank them, do business with them, I do that. The volunteers who are all around doing all this great work. And then I know personally that none of this could happen without the amazing dedication and abilities of Ruth Halsworth and Carol Hamill at the Mitchell Center. So we're fortunate to have an extraordinary poet in the house who can help us reflect on the world in which we live, the challenges we face, and the solutions we can create together. Gary Lawless, just a month ago, he and his wife, Beth Leonard, celebrated the 40th anniversary of their Brunswick bookstore, Gulf of Maine Books. And Gary's kind enough to come and read two poems for us today. Come on up, Gary. Please welcome him.
Thank you all for having some poetry and some space for poetry. I'm going to read two poems, not my own. They're short. Don't worry, I won't stay long. First one is called The Odyssey, and the second one is called The Iliad. And I'm going to be here for it. They all have water in them, a lot of water. The first poem is a poem by Miku Paul, who is a friend of mine and is a Maliseet writer and visual artist who grew up on the Penobscot. I apologize for any mispronunciations in Miku's poem. This is called The Water Road. All journeys begin here. Mattawamketuk, home, beside the good river, rocky at its mouth, stone shards, bone stratum. Buried deep our ancient cenotaph, old Meductic fort, traceless memorial. Now St. John, the name taken, baptized in ink and parchment. They say he knew water transformation. Water gives life. 1,000 years and more we paddled the old Meductic trail, the water road. Nomads, they called us, citing most ancient evidence of our passage, saying the solid rocks have been furrowed by the moccasins of the native tribes. A signpost, our chalcedony flesh, blue veins you call nature's highway, the map flowing inside our bodies, the thoroughfare, Chepneticook Lakes to Mattawamkeag, and onward to the Penobscot, where a girl becomes a woman. Her body craves the past, its waters seeking the cool flow, the ancestral memory, where tributaries meet, flooding, undernourished roots that cling to her edges, eroded year by year with forgetting, eroded with forgetting. Remember Meductic and the water road, birch bark, chert, and bone melded with riverbank clay, merging in the rippling shadows where canoes slide silent among water lilies and pickerel grass. Remember. And a poem by Lucille Clifton from a little bit south of here. The Mississippi River enters into the Gulf, and the Gulf enters into the sea, and so forth, none of them emptying anything, all of them carrying Yesterday, forever, on their white-tipped backs, all of them dragging forward tomorrow. It is the great circulation of the earth's body, like the blood of the gods, the river in which the past is always flowing, always flowing. Every water is the same water coming around. Every day, someone is standing on the edge of this river, staring into time, whispering mistakenly, only here, only now.
So just by FedEx is a wonderful book for you, Gary. Just arrived. The truck pulled up. I think he heard the end of the poem. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much, and I'll bring this down to you. One more time. So it's a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Bridie McGreavy. There's some great information about Bridie in the program, so I won't repeat it. Instead, I'd like to offer some more personal insights. And as you can probably gather from the title of her keynote, rivers have played an important role in Bridie's life and work, and the same goes for me. In the research I used to do on streams and rivers, I regularly peered into the water to study caddisflies and other aquatic insects that, for the majority of their lives, inhabit the surface of stones. As part of my work, I paid close attention to their life cycles, especially the immature stages called larval instars. And as you'll see, those experiences continue to shape my way of looking at the world. As near as I can tell, Bridie began life as a tiny egg in the Saco River near Brownfield, Maine, right where she was oviposited. And just like caddisflies, she hatched into a first instar larva and began exploring the wider, wetter world. Like all larvae, she underwent a sequence of molts, spent her second larval instar at Freiburg Academy. Next, she molted into a life history stage entirely new to science, a Mitchell scholar, while exploring a novel aquatic habitat called Bates College. I first met Bridie 10 years ago when she applied to pursue her PhD in environmental communication and sustainability science as part of a major grant led by the Mitchell Center. At the time, she looked to be about a fifth instar larva. Now, one of the more unconventional and, as it turns out, many called it harebrained scientific hypotheses I developed in my research was that the ecological success of insects depends in large part on whether they have good mentors. At the time, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. In retrospect, maybe not. But naturally, this made me want to help the larval Bridie by becoming one of her mentors. Now, who in this room has ever been a mentor to someone? I'm sure a lot of you have, so let's see a show of hands. Come on, more than that, I'm sure. Okay, so I always thought it would be really fun to be a mentor because you get to show the person how smart you are, and they look up to you. Now, technically, Bridie does look up to me. I'm about a foot taller than she is. But I quickly realized that Bridie was no ordinary larva. She had already gained tremendous experience exploring a wide range of habitats, and she developed a strong internal compass that would guide her in life. In fact, I guess that most of the people who've mentored Bridie have learned more from her than the other way around, including me. From Bridie, we've learned to pull on our boots and roll up our sleeves, to bring food and other sustenance to our partnerships, to listen intently, to flourish in Maine's long, cold winters, to dress up, when necessary, as a habitat, note the laugh, in this case as Verna L. Poole when Bridie was an environmental educator. There's nothing she wouldn't do for those kids. And in everything you do, she taught us to persevere. In all her work, Bridie seeks to create a world that is more diverse, more hopeful, more just, and more resilient. Now, you might think I'm laying it on a bit thick, so let me provide a quote from a more reliable source. I was on the mudflats not too long ago with a commercial clammer who's been in the business for 40 years. And I was asking him about some of the challenges he's experienced. He talked about the increasing problems stemming from closures caused by heavy rains, and of course about predation by green crabs. But then he pointed to Bridie, who was out of earshot far across the flats. And he said, Bridie is the best thing that has happened for clammers and the clam fishery in the last 10 years. And I just add, that's true of a lot of things she's been part of. Please join me in welcoming Bridie McGreavy.
Thank you very much, David, for that wonderful introduction. Good choice with the caddis. Happens to be my favorite insect. I appreciate those very, very kind words. I'm so honored to have been invited to give the keynote address at the Maine Sustainability Water Conference, my favorite conference, happens to be, and one that has really become like an old home days. We look out and see many familiar faces, and it's wonderful to see all of you. I'll say a bit more about this in the talk, and David also introduced it as well, but I grew up in the Saco River watershed in western Maine, which was homeland of the Secocas tribe of the Abnakis. And yet it wasn't until late in high school that I began to learn about the indigenous people who lived in that region and who were forced to move from their river. And this is in part why I think it's important to acknowledge that we are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn. And I'd ask that we extend our respect and gratitude to the many indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations. We make this acknowledgement aware of continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. And I appreciate the Abbey Museum for developing that acknowledgement. I'm very grateful, too, to be working with citizens of the Penobscot Nation and others, as I'll describe, and many more people in communities across the region. Actually, everything that I'm about to describe is dependent on a huge coalition of collaborators, and this is just a very partial list of some of the people who have been directly involved in some of the work that I'll share today. And I'll briefly acknowledge a few of them as I talk about the presentation, but I wanted to introduce a couple of people in particular, including Jan Paul and Angie Reed from the Water Resources Program in the Penobscot Nation, down front here. They'll be co-presenting part of this with me. I also work with an amazing team of students, including Tyler Quiring, who I see way in the back there, Gabby Hillier and Nolan Altvader, among others. The Mitchell Center is very much a hub for most of my work, where I get to work with people like David Hart, keeps things fun, as well as Darren Ranko and Sean Smith, who I know is circulating around here somewhere, and many more fun and supportive colleagues. And I really appreciate all the many ways they support this work. So what I'm planning to do today is to build from previous Maine Sustainability and Water Conference talks to focus specifically on communication for sustainability efforts and hopefully introduce some different ways of thinking about communication, focusing on listening, power, and poetry briefly at the end. I'll start with a couple of introductory examples that I'll then weave throughout the talk to illustrate how we've been able to address some of the challenges by attending to communication and power in our work together. Work through some commitments about what it means for us as we think with rivers. And then I'll come back to this beautiful starting point that Gary Lawless set up for us by returning to poetry to offer maybe an even more radical way of thinking about communication in our work. So this first example draws from Maine's clam fishery. The graph that you see here shows clam landings, which is a measure of the amount of pounds of clams sold to market every year. And these data in this graph are used to demonstrate changes and declines in clam landings over time, from the 1970s in particular to today, where they're at some of their lowest levels. These data are also used to explain declines in clam populations, but the two are not necessarily the same. We don't actually have good data on clam populations across the state, but we do know from the extensive in-depth observations and knowledge from the harvesters who are out on the flats every single day that we are seeing these kinds of changes in clam populations, due in part to climate change, warming ocean temperature, and changes in predation. Yet there's more to the story than this. This is an incomplete picture. Because when we look at some of the social aspects of what's going on here, it raises additional questions and things to pay attention to. At the same time we've had a decline in clam landings, we've also seen a decline in state license sales. So it raises the question, well, why are clammers not buying as many licenses? Certainly part of it is that it's harder to find clams. Clams and shellfish in Maine are also managed as part of a co-management system, which is based on a shared responsibility between the Maine Department of Marine Resources and the 74 municipalities in the state that have an ordinance. And through that program, they regulate the sale of town licenses, and we're increasingly in some towns seeing limited entry. It's harder to get a clam license. There's a lot of variability in the market, price fluctuations, where you can have clams go from, say, like $2.20 a pound to less than $1 seemingly overnight and with little reason. So it becomes hard to rely on it as a reliable source of income. There are complex relationships between shellfish dealers and market power, where clammers might come to a dealer station and they say, sorry, we're not buying clams today. And so what do? We're interested in interactions between fisheries and have some related research led by folks at College of the Atlantic looking at wormers and how clammers might be moving into worming because of the different kinds of relationships there. And then a lot of my work has looked at issues of equity and well-being. Because while on the one hand, clamming offers an incredible way to make a living, it's independent work, it's good physical exercise, it happens in some of the most beautiful places on the earth, I think, but it's also very physically demanding. And it puts clammers at higher risk of injury and possibly other complicating factors like substance use disorders. So there's a whole lot going on in this fishery. The second example is contrasting, and it intends to be contrasting, and I'll talk a little bit about that strategy. A different ecosystem altogether, different set of individuals involved, organizations, and definitely a different starting point. Because when we look at the Penobscot River restoration efforts, this is a story of clear success, of what's possible when a diverse group of collaborators can come together and identify a common goal. And in this case, they've had incredible success in removing 2 dams, having fish passage upgrades at 2 more dams, hydropower upgrades, and already seeing amazing returns in the fish populations. As you can see from both of these visuals here, a graphic supplied by the Water Resources Program, and then incredible returns at the Milford Fish Passage. From a communication perspective, we're really interested in how this success story gets told, and especially in news media, and as it relates to the longer-term interest in the Penobscot Nation in restoring this river and keeping this work ongoing. This is work that's in progress, and it's being led as part of Tyler's dissertation. One of the things that we've noticed as we've started to look at news articles is that they tend to emphasize and focus on fish, food chains, energy, and this is certainly part of the story. But we also want to know more about the social side of things. And from the perspective of the Penobscot Nation, the partners that we're working with there, we've learned that there's a missing part of the story about their ongoing efforts to restore and care for this water and extensive water monitoring and the work that's been going on in the context of this project. So we started to work with them to figure out, well, how do we tell this story in different ways? So these two contrasting examples intend to highlight some of the major challenges that we face in sustainability contexts where there's so much complexity, there's a lot of unknowns and data gaps, incomplete information, multiple perceptions of the problems that we face, and then oftentimes deep disagreements about what the real problem is. There is a situation with no quick fixes, and it gets even more complicated as we attend to issues of power, colonialism, and systemic inequities that create disparate impacts on some people more than others. So this focus on power has really become a central and growing concern of the sustainability science research that we do in the Mitchell Center. And this was a quote that Darren Ranko shared with me recently that I think gets to the heart of this concern. As Van Kerkhoff and LaBelle say, as soon as researchers become concerned with action, decision-making, and change, power can no longer be ignored because it's intimately entwined with our ability to act. And so what do we do with that? A communication lens can help us understand power, but it doesn't seek to resolve power because that's impossible. But focusing on communication can help us understand how power is operating in any situation and try to continually address issues of inequities to promote greater equity. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing, and we've been able to make a difference when it comes to these complex issues. I'll continue to work from these two cases of our ongoing work in coastal resilience and what we're calling the power of rivers. And this strategy of putting contrasting examples is also one that we use in the Mitchell Center. We found that doing so helps us identify similarities, differences, and broader insights across what seem like dissimilar types of situations. And we have a paper coming out on this in a book on environmental communication. So in our research with the shell fishery, we identified a need to strengthen equity, learning, and leadership. And we've been doing this in a number of different ways, but one of the ways has been to focus on the Shellfish Focus Day, which is associated with the Maine Fishermen's Forum. It's one of the most important learning events in the year of the shell fishery. Historically, it's been treated somewhat of an add-on to the Fishermen's Forum, and so we've been trying to find ways to address that, including like getting a bigger room, a double room, so it can accommodate the group and everybody can have a seat and be comfortable. And then we've also used a yearly evaluation survey, and we link the evaluation data with our planning. So this is advanced results from this year's Shellfish Focus Day, which was at the end of February. And the respondents have identified their top two interests in what they would like to see on the agenda next year. First is to have an update about the status of the shellfish resource. And this goes back to the fact that there are data gaps there. We don't have enough data. So keeping this on the radar, we want to hear from DMR, we want to hear from scientists, we want to hear from harvesters about what's going on with clams. And then this year, there was only one harvester who gave a talk, and the people who responded to this evaluation identified really wanting to hear from harvesters. And so this allows us to link these data with arguments about how to best set up the agenda so that it is inclusive and diverse. As we've been working with clammers, one of the things that we've heard is that part of some of the biases that exist against clammers and those who work in the mud is that there's just a general lack of awareness about what clammers do and how hard it is but what it takes to get clams from mud to market to plate. So we set up a project with them called Clam Cam, where they wore GoPro cameras and we went out and documented where they dig, how they dig, the different objects that they use, the places that they go. And these 18 videos that we have are available online, and it gives a clammer's eye view into what it is to clam in Maine. But we also recognize that a website's not enough. So we didn't take it as, if we build it, they will come type of approach. We actively worked with news media to grow the circulation of these videos and to raise awareness that this is there. And we've really been surprised at how interested the news media has been, in part because these videos are cool to watch. They have kind of a meditative quality to them, and they're in beautiful places. Most recently, a group of us have worked to develop the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience Project, which is funded by the Broadreach Fund of the Maine Community Foundation. Worked closely with Andrea Perry, who I know is also here somewhere, along with the Shellfish Advisory Council and a diverse science advisory committee. When Andrea and I were first talking about setting up this set of seed grants, we thought, like, if we get five proposals, that'll be good. And we ended up getting 17, and we were able to fund 14 of those. We really prioritized harvester and municipal leadership, and now there are a series of projects going on across the coast where people are trying to fill some of those data gaps and diversify the shellfish resource so they're not overly dependent on clams, and then also address some of those pressing water pollution issues. In terms of the work that we've been doing in the Power of Rivers, our most recent effort has been through the Future of Dams project. We're addressing this question of how do we link knowledge with decision making about dams. This is a highly interdisciplinary grant that was funded through a National Science Foundation grant to the Mitchell Center, along with our partners listed here. This graphic just intends to show the spreadsheet here that we have a number of different projects and papers, and every color represents a different discipline. So lots of people involved in addressing this question. I'm leading the communication efforts. I'm just going to share one small example of what we've been doing to address this question: how do we communicate about rivers, dams, and restoration? So going back to the news media example, in talking with Jan and Angie and others, we wanted to figure out, well, how do we raise awareness about the kind of work that the Penobscot Nation has been doing with water monitoring? We decided to try this out with my environmental communication class last fall, and I have several students who were in that class down here in the front. And addressing this question for us meant putting together 3 field trips, one of which was a river trip, a potluck ceremony, inviting 10 incredible guest speakers into the class, and supporting students in the development of 24 student projects in a service learning project we were calling Removing Our Blinders. Now, Removing Our Blinders was very much about helping students learn about the relationship between the Penobscot Nation and the Penobscot River, and the histories and the injustices. But Sherry Mitchell, who was one of our guest speakers and whose book we read, Sacred Instructions, I think really got to the heart of what we were trying to do in this project when she came to class and gave a public talk and posed these questions. Do we want to preserve our humanity? Do we want to preserve our compassion and awareness? Do we want to preserve our connection to the rest of life? Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. So students address these questions and more in a variety of different ways. So I've shared this visual here by Kyle Lima, which for me is one of the best visual representations that I've ever seen of this process of removing your blinders. That it's disorienting, it makes us pay attention to connections between humans and nature, past and present, and all with the full view of the river in the forefront. Several students felt the same kind of frustration and anger that I did as a high school student when I learned about this history that I didn't know about. Anger at the injustice of it, and anger that they didn't know, and so they did different things to try and address it, to communicate with non-native audiences about these histories. They wrote letters to family members, to the president of the university. One student put together a brochure so that first years would begin to learn about where they are in place, space, and time, and as it relates to the Penobscot Nation. At the end of the semester, several students commented on how this experience of communication across cultural boundaries about environmental issues and Indigenous rights was so important to them. So now, I want to invite Jan and Angie to come up here with me and co-present this next part, although they're not going to say anything unless they want to. We realized as we were getting ready for this talk that the genre of the keynote is not really amenable to sharing fully sharing the collaborative nature of the work that we do. So just as to give some kind of guidelines or guidance suggestions on how to read this video we're about to show, it's not a documentary. It's not intended to be a polished documentary. It's an attempt for us to experiment with how we show our process and how we can demonstrate how dialogue and relationship and learning from each other has really been central to our ability to do this work together. Here we go.
Nebi, Kazamobina, Kachiwali Nebi, Kachira Mira Hamobina.
Because to me, thinking of the river, I have to put myself, like anything living, right? If I'm to think like Angie, I have to put myself in Angie's shoes. Therefore, I have to be Angie, right? I have to think like Angie. Well, the same thing with the river. If I'm going to speak for the river, I have to know or feel what she's feeling. How would I feel if, I wasn't able to freely be able to sustain myself? I'm constantly being injected with toxins and expect my organs to function well. I'm relating to her, to be her. How do I do that? I just feel. I stop thinking and I start feeling. Because the environment's all around us. We got to stop thinking and start listening and feeling. So, and to have good communication, you need to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing for someone to do.
All kinds of reasons.
Mm-hmm. You're not just vulnerable with just anyone, because you open yourself up to, showing your weaknesses and according to mainstream society. So, you got to be careful, because then it could be used against you. So, to build that trust and then to be able to be vulnerable, it takes it a level up. But then that's when the practice comes in, and you constantly have to be on your game every day.
Our society does not encourage us to be okay with being wrong. I think, at some level, in my opinion, one way to avoid being wrong is ask lots of questions. Mm-hmm. Before you open your mouth, ask a lot of questions, or sit and listen, right? So you can learn a lot just by sitting and listening and being present, right? But you can also ask questions.
This is making me realize, that slide that I have with all the listening practices. I'm saying surveys and interviews. But really, what are those?
Asking questions.
Researcher.
Yeah, I would agree with you.
Nebi, Kazamobina, Kachiwali Nebi, Kachira Mira Hamobina.
Build from that dialogue, draw out 3 themes, exploring what it's meant to us to think with rivers, how we communicate by listening, and also what it means to create space for voice. So I've been thinking with rivers my entire life, as this picture shows, me and my sister down by the Saco River. I'm the tall one, for maybe the only time in my life. This picture was taken at the beach at the Green Bridge in Brownfield, if you're familiar with this area. And I really have my parents to thank who are down here in the front. Because of them, we grew up semi-aquatic in the Saco River, and I continue to feel a strong connection to this river. When I think about, or I'm asked about, why do I do this conservation work? Why has this been a commitment in my career? One of the first moments that comes to mind for me is when I was about 10 or 11. I was standing on the banks of this beach. And this was right around the time that the tourist industry that's so important for the economy in Western Maine, the canoe industry, was growing, but before many of the contemporary conservation efforts were in place. And it was August, and we had several days of rain. And everything that had accumulated on the river's banks washed into the river. So I was standing there looking at basically an open sewer. And I can still feel the smell of that lodged at the back of my throat. It was, for me, one of the first times that I fully felt the deep interconnections between humans and nature, in this case, the river. And then I think more recently, I've come to more fully acknowledge how the Saco River was teaching me something very important in that moment that has stayed, that has stuck. So thinking with rivers, for me, is about attending to that vitality and aliveness of the world and how it shapes who we are and what we do. And I've noticed a similar kind of dynamic in the clam fishery. And this started early on in some of my research and field work with them. I was out on a conservation dig where clammers were digging clams from a water quality closure and moving them to another cove so that they could, and replanting them so that they could dig them later in the season. And it was a cold, like wet day in, I think, April. I was in a boat with a clammer and we were paddling across the cove. And I was just wondering, like, why do this? What motivates you to come out here and do this kind of work? What do you like so much about clamming? And there are many factors involved, but in response to that question, he told me a story about paddling across this same cove. The moon was coming up, and every time he dipped his paddle into the water, it just exploded with this phosphorescent plankton. And so up until that point, I've been focusing on decision-making and co-management, science communication, trust in science, and this experience increasingly made me want to understand that ecological material influence in our motivations for this kind of work. And we had an opportunity in the Removing Our Blinders project to go even deeper and learn even more about this kind of relationship. So Margot Lukens, who's an English professor at the University of Maine, and Carol Dana, who is a Penobscot elder and knowledge keeper, came into the class and shared with us their book project, They Remember Me Still, which will be coming out in a couple of months. And Carol read in the Penobscot Nation one of the 13 Gluskape stories, and it was a story about how Gluskape created the river and the clan names. And the students had already been out on the field trip, and hearing this story and learning about the Penobscot Nation's family ties to the river gave a new and deepened understanding of the commitment to monitor the water. So for the next one, communicating by listening requires that we think about what does it mean to listen. And this is the question I posed to the class in the fall. It's the first time I'd asked students to do this. I said, when I say listen, draw what comes to mind. I almost asked you, Owen, for a copy of it because many of the images were of headphones and large disembodied ears. And so I thought, what's going on here in terms of how we think about listening? And then I Googled it and saw some similar patterns to how the students were visualizing it, emphasizing listening as an individual, solitary activity, that it's mostly passive as long as we're smiling and nodding, right? Increasingly, it's technological. There's an abstraction to listening. And I saw many images of the enlarged ear, emphasizing listening as something that happens through a single sense organ, and that we could get good at it if we just had big enough ears. So this isn't to say that listening isn't those things. It is. There are elements of that. But from a communication perspective, we can expand how we think about listening as a practice to recognize that listening is contextual. What it means to listen is different in place to place. Listening is demonstrated, and it's demonstrated in the commitment to consider and then respond, and what we would call cultivating response ability, which is very much dependent on the kind of vulnerability that Jan was describing, that openness to consider and to respond and to be in relationship. In terms of the specific practices, we can think about process and technical elements of listening. These are similar across the work in coastal resilience and with rivers, we found. As Angie emphasized, helping me get out of my researcher head, that listening is about asking questions. And in our work, we do that systematically, and we do it in a whole variety of different ways, but we found that the use of surveys and interviews can be a way of demonstrating listening. As you're showing, I heard what you said, and we're trying to act on it continuously. Some of the work that Karen Hutchins-Bielek led as part of her dissertation has helped us think about the need to do this, especially early in partnerships, but in an ongoing way to get a sense of people's perceptions about problems, their experiences, their needs for information, so more focused ways of asking questions. We've done a lot of work in collaborative media and writing, and have found that this can be a really effective way of demonstrating listening as you're working through a Google Doc together and can actually post comments and those kinds of things. And the video that you saw is another example of that. It was a great experience of deep listening and editing. In terms of technical commitments, I cannot overstate the importance of meeting minutes in all ways and good notes out of meetings. But more than just keeping them as a record, providing them as an opportunity to negotiate what was actually said and heard. And then storing these kinds of documents in information archives so that listening doesn't have to necessarily always be face-to-face, interpersonal. It can be asynchronous. So that if people have access to information, they can come in if they weren't at a meeting or need to follow up and have a more informed approach to interacting. We have, in a number of different projects, explored governance as a way of stating our commitment to listening and specifying the practices like responding to email in a timely manner. And we provide those online, the Future of Dams Governance Statement, if you're interested in it as a model. And then I want to signal that there's an extensive body of literature and in engaged research and in decolonizing methods. And I provide a link here to a resource list that we compiled that supported the development of the Removing Our Blinders if you're interested in accessing that. And then even more expansively, to go beyond listening through the ear, to think about embodied, full body forms of listening. Tony Sutton, who's a PhD student at University of Maine, came in and gave a guest lecture based on his work with Passamaquoddy and Micmac tribes and a concept he developed called presence. This showing up and listening with the full body. And this concept, presence, really became an important one for our class. And it helps students when they're out on the river be open and open to the influence of the world and to learning from the river. So then the third and last one is about creating space for voice. And I added especially those historically silenced or ignored. Before I talk about voice, I want to briefly touch on trust. Because I often find when I give talks about communication, I get this question, well, what about trust? And it's not that trust isn't important, it is. But trust raises a whole series of questions. How do you build it, maintain it? What do you do if you lose or break it? What if what you trust isn't in your best interest? And then most importantly, what if trust is really difficult, maybe even impossible, in historic and present power disparities and injustices? What then do you do? So in communication, we tend to emphasize voice over trust, and this, like listening, we have a limited understanding of it, or a more narrow, that it emphasizes the individual person. But we might come to think about space and time as voice as well, such that this space at Shellfish Focus Day is an expression of voice. We've learned a lot from Susan Seneca's work. She looked at the National Environmental Policy Act, public participation processes, and developed a concept called Trinity of Voice that emphasizes the importance of access, standing, and influence that must be present to build and maintain trust. And if these aren't there, people who are involved in a process will try to claim them. And this can be very disruptive ultimately for the shared sustainability objectives. In our work, we've been able to build from her understanding of these three practices of voice and contribute to it. So I'll say a little bit about that. In terms of the common understanding of access, Seneca emphasizes, do people have access to participate? Is the meeting held at a time that works for most people? Is the location easy to get to? Is the physical space accessible to people with multiple abilities? And then information is really about, do people have access to the information to know what's on the agenda, what's going to be talked about, how they can have an informed decision? In our work with clambers, we've also recognized the really important influence of the tides in shaping their ability to participate. That if a meeting is held at low water, it's going to cost clambers $200 to $300. And so they wouldn't have the same kind of access as other people, and that's an inequity. And in terms of information, if we mean scientific information, then people who aren't scientists or have other forms of knowledge aren't going to have the same kind of access either. And so how do we think about opening that access for multiple forms of knowledge so that science is part of it, but it's not the only source of information or meaning? The second one, standing, is often also referred to as civic legitimacy. In the context of co-management, we find that the town boundaries really influence who can show up at a meeting and have voice to be able to weigh in on ordinance changes. But we've also seen within the co-management system that the issues with substance use disorders that I mentioned earlier can influence relative standing within that community, where harvesters who struggle with substance use disorders or are in recovery don't necessarily have the same kind of standing, and this can contribute to conflict in co-management. So taking a more holistic look at how do we improve adaptive capacities in this space. And then in the context of tribal sovereignty, I think we really see the limits of thinking about civic legitimacy. And we had an experience out on the water that helped us begin to think about that. So we had what I'll call a little boat trouble. And we had to dock or pull ashore on Orson Island, which is the Penobscot Nation's territory. And a citizen of the Penobscot Nation came across this boat of white kids and asked them what they were doing and told them to stay off the island. And this was unsettling for students, in part because it marked them as white. It potentially implicated them in the history that they've been learning about, and it made them feel unsettled. But this experience became a touchstone for us throughout the semester. We talked about how respecting tribal sovereignty might mean feeling unsettled and standing down or stepping back, but also finding ways of staying with. So for influence, the final one, I could just say, see listening practices above, because that really helps the process transparency. But again, when we go consider issues of tribal sovereignty and broken promises and treaties, pointing to influence in a system defined by colonialism may not be enough. And so here we might be able to come back and think with rivers again to emphasize not influence but confluence. How do we set up participation processes where rivers of roughly equal width flow together? And going back to the Penobscot River restoration efforts, that really seems to be a key part of the dynamic that enabled the success of that group. So staying with that river metaphor, turning it more fully to metaphor and return to poetry, I now want to consider the transformative and alive quality of language. I've been wondering about poetry for years. Early on in my dissertation, I went to an annual meeting of the Frenchman Bay Partners. We shared what the Bay meant to us, and people said things like water quality, eelgrass, recreation, and at the end, my friend and partner said, I wanted to say that the Bay, speaking of aliveness of the world, I wanted to say that the Bay gives me poetry, but I didn't, because I thought that would be silly. So I've wondered about this. What place does poetry have in our conservation work? When we look at the etymology, poetry comes from poesis, which is a making or a doing, which goes beyond the form of poetry to think about what does poetry do. And we might also, at the same time, think about metaphor as poetry. Again, we think about metaphor as a transference, one term for another, but metaphor in its etymology is about movement. So it makes me wonder what kinds of metaphors might we use to find ways to move together differently. And by working with tribal citizens, clammers, students, and many others, I've increasingly noticed the pervasiveness of biological and bodily metaphors, the river in our veins, the tide as breath. And I think that metaphors like these might help us remember our connections to each other in the world and cultivate an ethic of care from thinking with rivers, listening to each other, and finding voice for just sustainability. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions.
Yep, we have time for a few questions. So the way this is going to work is that we've got wonderful folks up front who have going to bring the microphone to you, I think. So raise your hand if you have a question for Bridie.
Thanks, Bridie, for a really excellent talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of co-developing questions with communities and whether that's part of the process that you use.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In short, yes, that is the process that we use. And it can take a variety of different forms. Sometimes we will have, in interviews or in surveys, ways of asking about the kinds of research questions that matter most to folks. Other times, the questions come up in the course of doing things together. So one example of that I didn't even really fully recognize it as a research question, but in some of the work I've been doing, clamming communities, they were asking, how do we open close clam flats? And at first I didn't really recognize that as a communication research question, but I knew it was important to the partners that we were working with, and so we started to work on it together, and in doing that work together came to realize that, oh yeah, this is really so much about communication in terms of who needs to be involved in the decision-making process, tracking the problem forms and information systems, and keeping track of progress over time. So in my experience, that has been a really crucial part of producing knowledge, and I say knowledge intentionally because it's not just science, but a whole range of ways of knowing that are meaningful for people and that continue to inform ongoing work.
Your talk was very amazing. I was just wondering, when you were talking about with the trust and how sometimes it can be hard to do, or when they went to the island and they were asked to leave, have you taught your students any practices with learning how to deal with taking a step back and that trust can't always be given in any sort of ways like that?
Oh, I'm so tempted to pass the mic right over there. I guess I don't think of it necessarily as practices, but the dialogue that we had and the involvement of the different guest speakers, but really it was a co-teaching experience that was essential for debriefing and talking about how students were understanding that experience and addressing questions. We did actually have a semester-long assignment called Thinking Within the River, which was a reflective journal. There were different prompts that students did, and one of them did focus, actually a couple of them focused on asking students to reflect on their changing understanding and what that's bringing up for them. So yeah, I guess you could consider that a practice, but it was very much based in the dialogue. Do you have anything you want to add to that? Or ask a question?
I actually think that just having really, I mean, so the neat part I'll share that these 3 students that were in the class, the minute we got here today, Jan and I, they were like, "Hey, you guys," and I was like, that's a really neat relationship building. So I think that's a large part of why we were able to really sit and process. We were not actually asked to leave, just to be clear. We were just, so I was in the boat while Jen was working on the other boat that needed help without all the details. And so we just sat and processed it, and we just said, hey, what's going on? We don't need to take offense to this. And we described tribal sovereignty, we described reservation islands, and that people needed permission to be on the island. And it was just like, we had a counselor come to the Indian Island School recently, and he talked with the parents about how, when your child falls, and if you go over with this immediate reaction, then the kid mimics you. And we just sat and talked about it, right? It wasn't any big deal. So can I ask a question of you also?
I think so. Do we have time for
one more?
Yeah.
I'm interested in the unsettling part. You as a researcher, have you felt any unsettling in your experience in this? And if so, how did you process and deal with it? And can you recommend to other researchers? Because we work with a lot of people at Penobscot Nation, and I don't know how other people feel, if they feel unsettled, and if you can offer them any advice.
Yeah. That could probably be the focus of a whole talk, or maybe a book or something. But yes, I have felt unsettled. The first thing that came to mind was more about in the teaching experience. And we've talked about this a little bit, but this kind of co-teaching, for me as an instructor, required that I just let go of control over a lot of elements that I'm used to having control over, like designing the syllabus and picking out the readings and setting up the activities. But ultimately, I just found it was so worth it. It was so transformative because in the collaboration, we just develop much better ideas together. Get multiple people genuinely thinking, and it just becomes a better experience. And I think that's true in research too. That, I've done research that's been a more kind of what you traditionally see of, working independently, coming up with the research questions. It's not that they're not as good, but ultimately, in my experience, they're not as useful. And that linking knowledge with action is, when it really happens, is so rewarding and motivating.
So, it's about time for lunch, and I think there are many people here who I won't be surprised if want to grab Bridie during lunch and talk to her some more. I encourage you to do so. But for now, we'll move on to that, except that you've noticed Bridie spends a lot of time on the clam flats. So what better gift for her than from Edgecombe Potter's Middless Edgeless, the mussel. There you go. So let's thank Bridie.